Hello, everyone. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce Thomas Graham to talk about his new book, Getting Russia Right. Before doing so, I'd just like to say a couple of other things. First, questions. Tom and I will talk for about half an hour, and then I will pass on questions from the audience. Could you put them, please, in the Q&A, which you will see at the bottom of your screens? Secondly, just to flag two panels coming up. Tomorrow, I will be moderating one on the latest conflict in, well, what used to be Nagorno-Karabakh. And then on Thursday, my colleague Stephen Simon will be moderating a panel on the war in Gaza and what it means for the Middle East and for US policy. So two Quincy panels this week, which I hope you will be able to attend. Now for today, a great pleasure and honor to introduce an old friend, Thomas Graham. Tom is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a research fellow at Yale University. He was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia at the National Security Council. And when I was there as a journalist in the 1990s, Tom was acting political counselor at the US Embassy in Moscow. And Tom has just published a book on the basis of this long experience as one of America's leading practitioners and commentators on relations with Russia, Getting Russia Right. Tom, welcome.
Glad to be here with you.
I'd like to begin by asking, you and I, both being of a certain age, I remember I was there in the early 90s when there were these tremendous hopes, convictions even, for a future of amicable US-Russian relations. It seemed to me at the time that given that America and Russia, as opposed to the Soviet Union, had never had any really serious problems historically, there was no reason not to expect that. Now, of course, in retrospect, this looks like a complete fantasy. But do you think that the collapse of relations was in some sense foreordained, given the basic positions of both sides, or could it have been avoided?
Well, I think in many ways we misread the situation at the end of the Cold War. We did look forward to amicable relations. We were very confident that because in our mind, the Cold War spelled the victory of liberal democracy over communism 50 years after we defeated fascism in the Second World War, that a country, in order to survive and thrive into the 21st century, needed to develop free market democracy. We thought this was particularly true of Russia. As you know, there were certainly Russian leaders who said that's the direction in which they wanted to move. We were caught up by the end of history, globalization, and we made a tremendous effort at that time to assist Russia in its transition to free market democracy. I think we misread the situation because if you looked at what really happened in Russia, what we saw was not a democratic revolution so much as a power struggle that was won by the Russian political elite over the remnants of the Soviet political elite. And that elite, by and large, was really in tune in its basic attitudes with the Soviet elite. That is, it believed in a strong Russian state. It believed in Russia as a great power. And so the fundamental contrast between our two positions was the United States really wanted to change Russia, wanted to transform it into a liberal Western democracy. The Russian political elites, despite what some of its leaders were saying, was focused on rebuilding Russia's power, reasserting itself on the global stage. Those are two fundamentally different attitudes that soured relations over time. Second point I would make, I think, Anatol, you're absolutely right that we had antagonism during the Cold War. But I think if you look back historically, not so much to the beginning of US-Russian relations, but the late 19th century, you will see that there were the beginnings of rivalry on the global stage. Two expansionary powers that came into conflict, not in Europe, but actually out in the Far East and Manchuria at that point. And attitudes towards Russia began to sour at that point. And we began what became a relationship of rivalry from that time, obviously intensified during the Cold War because of differences, ideological differences, but reemerged slowly in the post-Cold War period. And that, I would argue, is where we are right now.
Mm. Do you think, it sometimes seemed to me that what has been called the Wolfowitz doctrine, which called for, essentially US primacy in every region of the world, and that no other country would have any influence beyond its borders, except that explicitly allowed to it by the United States. Boiled down, I think it's fair to say that's what Wolfowitz was calling for. And that in many ways actually became the standard operating procedure of all succeeding US administrations, perhaps qualified to a degree under Obama. And that, it seems to me, was always going to be quite unacceptable to any country which was, or whose establishment was absolutely imbued with the notion that its country must be a pole of a multipolar world, something which is true, of course, of China, of Russia, also of India, by the way. Were those basic positions always likely to lead to conflict, or could it have been, could that have been moderated or nuanced by better diplomacy, better policies?
Well, look, Anatol, you're absolutely right that Russia was never going to accept the role of a junior partner in a US-led world order. It thought of itself and continues to think of itself as a great power, and that is a country that pursues an independent foreign policy to advance its own national interest. So it would have had to have been something different, and we required a certain modification in the goals that the United States was going to pursue at that point. I think the question that we need to ask at this point is whether it was possible to construct a foreign policy, a relationship with Russia that wouldn't have been one of strategic partnership. I don't think the conditions were in place for that, but whether we could have avoided the adversarial relationship that we had today. Even if we were in competition, even we were rivals to some extent, could that have been a constructive rivalry kept within bounds that would have left us in a much better position than the one we're in today? And I think the short answer to that is yes. A different set of policies pursued with some strategic patience, beginning in the early years after the breakup of the Soviet Union into the 2000s, quite likely would have led to a more constructive relationship between our two countries than the one that we have today.
To what extent do you think on both sides purely irrational factors played a role? Because for many years, of course, it's been hard to watch Russian television without falling over extreme instances of paranoia and hatred directed at the United States. But I have to say that when I first came to Washington as a visiting fellow in 96 to 97, I was at a time when America appeared, of course, to be completely safe and all-powerful in the world. I was struck by the degree of, I have to say, visceral, in some individual cases, hatred would not be too strong a word, I think, for Russia in sections of the Washington elites, or at least perhaps hatred is too strong, obsessive dislike, something of the sort. Is that fair, or do you think that that actually more, what would you call it, more thought out policies were to blame?
Well, look, it was a very complicated situation, complex at that time. You need to remember that the American national security establishment was pretty much built on pushing back against the Soviet Union, that is Russia. The fundamental national security agencies were established in the late 1940s and 1950s. People made their careers fighting the Soviet threat, and that lingered into the post-Soviet period. So it's true that you found in elements of the defense establishment, the intelligence community, people that had an abiding suspicion of Russia, and that was reflected in the way they thought, the types of policies they pursued, and so forth. All that said, there were elements in the policymaking community that did believe that Russia had to move in a free market, democratic direction, that this would be good, that it was possible to build an enduring partnership with Russia. So there was always tension between the two. That reflected itself in policy. And clearly, this is also something that the Russian side, the Kremlin, also sensed as it dealt with various elements of the United States in the 1990s and the 2000s.
I mean, I suppose also part of the problem as far as the Russian masses were concerned was precisely that as you say, the not very or questionably democratic and ostensibly or in would-be free market reforms of the 1990s turned into such a disaster as far as most ordinary Russians were concerned.
Well, it wasn't only that. There are a couple of things here. Obviously, the economic reforms did lead to a serious socioeconomic crisis that impacted on the Russian population in very profound ways, almost all negative. What was the functioning Soviet middle class was basically eliminated by the economic reforms. Teachers, professional classes became destitute during that period. But it's also true that while the United States was preaching democracy, we tended to overlook sort of democracy when it ran contrary to our interest in Russia. Few people remember that the freest and fairest elections in Russia probably occurred in the late Soviet period under Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. That the conflict in 1993 that erupted between Yeltsin as president and the then Congress of People's Deputies was presented as a conflict between democratic reformers and red-brown, communist and nationalist retrogrades. But that Congress of People's Deputy was actually democratically elected. When the conflict was resolved in Yeltsin's favor, they put in place a new constitution and ran elections in 1993. Who won? The communist and the nationalist. But that had no impact on policy. Policy continued to be the radical reform supported by the United States with our support. And so what the Russians learned was that democracy had its limits, that if we participated in these elections and voted for certain individuals, that would have no impact on the actual policy that the government pursued. So they lost faith in free market reforms. They lost faith in democracy in the 1990s, in part as response to policies that the United States pursued at that time.
Yes, it probably would not be a good idea to look too closely into the management of the 1996 presidential elections, which is why indeed Western governments didn't look too closely into that issue. I was told quite explicitly that we certainly didn't want to know if Yeltsin had rigged them, since we wanted him to win. Mm-hmm. Were you surprised that 9/11 did not lead to a restoration of better relations? Senior Russian officials I've talked to, and from what I gather, Putin himself, genuinely were surprised. They thought that this would lay the basis for a new relationship. And yet the Bush administration doesn't appear to have really seriously considered that at all, or at least if it came to modifying its policy towards Russia.
Well, I'm not so sure that that's fully the case. The relationship did improve in many ways after 9/11. It led to the signing of a joint declaration in the spring of 2002 that actually laid out a framework for strategic partnership going forward. This is the moment in which we set up the NATO-Russia Council that was supposed to give Russia a voice in NATO affairs, if not a veto, as we always said at that point. I think the problem was that there were certain assumptions made about how we would conduct the counterterrorist campaign together. And it turned out that the ideas on the both sides differed in radical ways. If you remember, after 9/11, the United States and President Bush presented a binary choice. You're either with us or you're with the terrorist. That didn't apply when it came to Chechnya. And you, Anatol, you know a lot about this event, having spent some time on the ground. But, the position of the US government was that there were Chechen rebels who had legitimate grievances. And even if they were working together with elements that we consider terrorist, we were not prepared to condemn them as terrorists the way we were the Taliban for their work with Al-Qaeda. The Russians saw all the rebels as terrorists of some sort, and they expected fairly firm US cooperation in dealing with Chechnya. And it's that inability to come to a common agreement on how to deal with the Chechens, I think, that undermined, certainly in the Kremlin, the view that the United States was prepared for an equal partnership with Russia. And so the Beslan terrorist attack, when a small group of Caucasian terrorists overtook the public school on opening day, took hundreds of people hostages. It ended in a rescue operation, if that's what you want to call it, that left over 300 people dead, many of them children. The Russians saw a U.S. hand in that. I think that's incorrect, but that's certainly what the Kremlin did. And that led to a souring of the relationship with the United States and a reassessment of how to conduct the relationship going forward.
Yes, I mean, it wasn't just the Kremlin. I remember a Russian member of the sort of liberal state establishment, I suppose you would say, who was livid with fury at the way in which parts of the US media really did tie themselves in knots, trying not to call Beslan a terrorist attack,
Right.
calling it a siege, and really trying to blame all the bloodshed on the Russian forces. That caused, real anger in sections of Russian.
Right. Right, and ran contrary to the way we talked about terrorism.
Absolutely.
And when it was directed against us, against our allies, and actually President Bush was quite clear on this, that the terrorists were responsible for the deaths that occurred afterwards. He said that about Beslan as well. But you're right, there were elements in the American press that didn't buy that story. There were elements in the American press that were sympathetic to the Chechen rebels. Now, it's a very complicated situation, and you can make an argument in favor of the Chechen rebels. There were legitimate grievances. You look at the history of Moscow's relations with the Chechens going back to the 19th century. That's not. I
wrote a book on the subject.
I know you did, but that's not the point. The point was that it was contrary to the way we spoke of and framed the terrorist attack. So the Russians expected a different reaction, and when they didn't get that reaction, that led to the reassessment of the relationship with the United States.
In the Middle East, on that score, I've sometimes argued myself that it would have been better, not just for the Middle East, but for the United States itself, if on occasions America had followed Russian policy or Russian advice. And once again, I found real bewilderment in Russia over the Western stance both on Syria and on Libya, because people said to me, "But look, after the disaster of Iraq, how can they still be I mean, whatever the horrors of the Syrian regime, how can they be trying to destroy more Middle Eastern states and open the way, perhaps for terrorism?" There was, I mean, it seemed odd, frankly, even to me, but certainly, I mean, it caused a measure of, once again, bewilderment, I think.
Well, remember, there's as you know, I mean, there is a large dose of ideology to American foreign policy, and what happened in the Middle East, starting in 2010, 2011, for many Americans was a functional equivalent of what happened in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, right? So Eastern Europe breaks out of the Soviet bloc. You have, in the American view, successful reforms. Most of those countries had joined NATO or the EU by 2011. And the immediate reaction to the Arab Spring was, this is the functional equivalent. This is the liberal democratic revolution unfolding in the Middle East. And then we supported various people, rebel forces, with that framework in mind. It turned out that it was much more complicated, that there were other forces at play in the Middle East, far from democratic in orientation. And by the time we figured this out, the worst had happened in Libya and Syria, for example. So, part of this is an inability of the American political elites to understand what the real dynamics are on the ground, to want to see democratic revolutions, because that's what we're hoping for, and overlooking the other elements that lead to a different type of outcome.
Well, having discussed one immortal question, kto vinovat, we now come on to the next, kto dělat. And
Right.
in your book, you have a number of very interesting ideas for how relations could, to some extent, be repaired, or at least prevented from continuing to head towards complete disaster. Could you tell us something about your thoughts on how we might get out of the present mess?
Well, this is more than a one-step process,
Yes.
to put it mildly. And there are two elements to this. I mean, we have the current conflict in Ukraine, and we have the longer-term relationship with Russia. Those two are related. The first part of this is we need to find a way to resolve the current conflict, so that we've also laid the basis for a longer-term relationship with Russia. We have done, I think, to my mind, a good deal of what is proper in supporting Ukraine, and preventing the Russians from overrunning the country. Where we have fallen down is that we've lacked a diplomatic element to this, that we need in some ways to find a way to reach out to the Russians, to push this towards some sort of diplomatic or negotiated settlement at some time in the near term. To the extent that we can or produce or help birth a Ukraine that is strong, prosperous, democratic, anchored in the West, we will have succeeded in Ukraine, even if Ukraine doesn't regain all the territory that it's lost since 2014. What I would underscore here, this is a long-term project. This is not something that you achieve in 1 or 2 years, and it certainly goes well beyond anything that happens on the battlefield. So we need to prepare for the long run. But that would, I think, send an important signal to Russia that we know what we're about, we know where we want to go, and that we're prepared now to sit down with Russia and talk about the things that we need to deal with over the long term: strategic stability, European security, and I would argue China. Obviously, there's a role for the United States and Russia in strategic stability. No matter how much the geopolitical and strategic landscape has changed and is changing, we still are the two largest nuclear powers in the world. We have a special responsibility to ensure that those weapons are not used in anger. So we will have to figure out a way to restart strategic stability talks, think through what strategic stability means in the current environment going forward. We'll need to figure out a way to rebuild European security, not as an effort directed against Russia, but as a cooperative effort. And we'll need to figure out a way to work with one another to ensure that China's growing role on the international stage is consistent with our interest and with Russia's interest going forward.
Yes, I think you put your finger on something terribly important there, which is that the overwhelming assumption in Washington at the moment seems to be that helping Ukraine by definition involves weakening Russia or continuing to weaken Russia. But another way of looking at this would be to say that it would be very difficult, in my view, for Ukraine to prosper and advance and move towards the European Union as long as a war or even a semi-frozen conflict with Russia exists. One cannot think of an example of a country that has moved towards membership of the European Union, for example, in circumstances like that. I mean, especially, of course, given both the underlying poverty of Ukraine, but also the destruction done by the war. So is it necessary to shift our basic mindset there on what helping Ukraine involves?
Well, I would agree with you on that. And it would help. We need to shift our mindset as to how we're going to define a victory or what our goals are in this regard. And as I've already said, the goal should not be the restoration of Ukraine within its boundaries of 1991. It should be focusing on what Ukraine needs to do in order to prepare itself for membership in the EU, for anchoring itself in the West. That is a long-term project. The territorial issue in that regard becomes secondary, if not insignificant. You need to move this conflict towards some sort of resolution for precisely the reason that you stated. It's hard to imagine a country joining the EU if it's still at war with another country. That simply isn't going to happen. It's also going to make it very difficult to provide the long-term types of security guarantees that the Ukrainians are looking for. So a precondition for anchoring finally Ukraine in the West is a resolution of the conflict in the East. That's part one of this. Second part is, one ought to be careful what they wish for when it comes to weakening Russia. And one of the points that I make in the book is that, post-conflict will still need a Russia that is strong enough to maintain reliable command and control of its nuclear weapons, a Russia that is strong enough to effectively govern its territory so that the instability there does not spill over into other areas. We need a Russia that is strong enough to be able to take on and implement obligations as far as climate change is concerned. And then the point that is more, I think, controversial, but one that I think is extremely important, is we need Russia to be strong enough to act as a player in these various types of ad hoc regional coalitions we're going to try to establish to maintain stability and equilibria in strategic parts of the world. And it's going to be much more difficult to do that if Russia is not part of that, particularly if you think about Northeast Asia, if you think about the Arctic.
Yes, George Beebe and I made this point about the Middle East in a piece last week, in which we pointed out that because of fear of terrorism, Russia has actually some good reasons to play a stabilizing role there if we can encourage it to do so. But tell me, a rather gloomy question, but do you think that President Biden's latest address has in fact simply foreclosed our hopes for this kind of US policy towards Russia for the foreseeable future?
I think that's certainly the case. You're not going to see any outreach to Russia in the near term, I would argue. The Russians themselves, I mean, to be fair to the Biden administration, don't seem to be particularly interested in negotiation at this point. I'm sure that factored into the way the president articulated America's goals last Thursday. It's hard to envision a significant improvement or change in course before the presidential elections in November of next year. I think the Russians are focused on that election as an important point in determining what the direction of American policy is going to be for, what their options are. And clearly, given the differences between the presidential candidates at this point, it will also have a significant impact on how the United States pursues its goals in the world, depending on whether President Biden is reelected or we get a take U.S. policy in a somewhat different direction. Perhaps not as radical if it's not Trump, but nevertheless a different direction from where the Biden administration is at this point.
Well, now questions from the audience. The first, you participated earlier this year in a meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, something that has attracted a great deal of unfavorable criticism in America. But could you tell us anything about that? And also, is there a role at present for track 2 meetings of this kind, or do attitudes on both sides and policies on both sides make this impossible?
Well, look, the first point to make is that the meeting with Lavrov was not track 1.5, it wasn't track 2. Foreign Minister Lavrov, like Secretary Blinken, when he travels to various capitals, often asks to meet local experts to exchange views on what is happening in the world. That's pretty much what happened with the meeting in the spring of this year with Lavrov. So this is not a negotiation. It's not passing messages. It's an exchange of views on what's happening more broadly in U.S.-Russian relations. So I think it was misread by many people on the outside. As far as track 2s are considered, they may not have a dramatic impact on government policy at this point, but I would argue that it's critical that we maintain lines of communication, particularly between the expert communities, if relations have, for all practical purposes, been severed at the official level. We need to have a better understanding of how Russians are looking at the world, what they see as their goals, what they think about the United States. All of this is essential to avoiding the types of misunderstandings and misperceptions that can turn a crisis into a direct military confrontation that neither side wants. So I encourage it. I think this is good. It would be helpful if the U.S. government were more supportive in its public comments about contacts between the expert community. Obviously, it would help if the Russian government were saying the same thing. My sort of sense is that in both Washington and Moscow, there is pressure not to do these types of things. I think that works to the disadvantage of both countries over time.
Yes, I mean, in a way, it's not so surprising on Moscow's side. Maybe prejudice, but there are, shall we say, traditions at work here. But as somebody who remembers the Cold War, and my father was head of the BBC Russian service, and we were, officially so anxious to try to find out what the Soviets were thinking. We were actively trying to promote such meetings and encounters, and of course, it was the Soviet Union that was blocking it. It seems damned odd to me, to be honest. This attitude. I mean, even from the standpoint of know your enemy, that any kind of contacts are automatically illegitimate.
Right, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. But remember, in the United States, it's not only the U.S. government that is not, let's put it mildly, enthusiastic in its support for these types of things. Although I think there's an element that understands that these are important, that is interested in what these contacts produce and what is learned. But also, there's a broader political class in the United States, particularly in Washington, that has made Russia toxic and believes that such contacts are inappropriate at this moment, to say the least, and make an explicit effort to discourage those types of contacts. So that's not helpful either. And you're absolutely right. You would think, given our experience in the Cold War, given the way we have thought about how you project American values and attitudes, that you would be encouraging these types of conflicts, particularly now, as a way of maintaining channels of communication, as a way to ensuring that Russians have a clear understanding of what we're trying to achieve, and why we're trying to achieve that, and how we see relations with Russia, not only in the current situation, but over the longer term. I think that would be good for the United States, and it would help prepare the ground for a more constructive relationship with Russia, certainly post-conflict.
A question about Ukraine. Has the conflict there been produced by the pursuit of maximal or maximalist goals by both the United States and Russia? And do you see any signs that either or both are backing away from those maximal goals? Because certainly, I mean, if they continue to be pursued, then any kind of compromise becomes by definition impossible.
Right, but let's not forget the Ukrainians in all of this, right? They're central. They have very explicit goals that have been well articulated. The question we should be asking is whether they're achievable or not. But certainly public opinion polls in Ukraine indicate support for this, continuing this conflict, and belief that the Ukrainians can expel the Russians from all the territory.
I would just like to say, though, I mean, majority support, right, but not unanimous.
But majority counts in something that is has goals of being a democratic society, and it's not a 51 plus 50 plus 1 type of split. It's more 60, 40, 70, 30 at this point. So that's significant. What I find sort of curious about this conflict when you're speaking about Russia and the United States is that neither side has articulated clearly either a theory of victory or a theory of defeat. We don't know what Russia's ultimate goals are in Ukraine. They certainly have been ambiguous about that. We don't know under what conditions Russia would decide to throw in the towel, saying, the military effort is no longer worth it because we can't achieve whatever our goals are. So in a strange situation where you can't define victory and you can't define defeat, it's always better to continue the conflict, right? Because we may be marching towards victory and we may be warding off defeat. Same thing's true of the United States. The position of the United States is we will be there for as long as it takes, without defining what it is. Again, you're seeing some debate open up in the United States as what our ultimate goals are, in part based on what we think is achievable at this point. But yet, we still don't have clear articulation from the administration of what they would like to see happen over the long term. When will we know that we've achieved our goals in Ukraine? Or when will we know that those goals are unachievable? Not clear at all.
Yes, and of course, history is a long business. Even 40 years ago, we would have considered a situation in which 80% of Ukraine was independent of Russia and at least desirous of joining the West as a tremendous victory, and anything beyond that as hubris. Where we will be 40 years from now or 100 years from now.
Well, where will be 100 years from now, I would imagine.
Well, in our case, we know.
Yes. To me and most of the people listening to this conversation.
Well, but in terms of relations with Ukraine. Another question, could Russia ever accept, well, I think it's made, first it's clear, Ukrainian membership of NATO or the European Union? Or would Russia always act to do whatever was necessary to frustrate those goals?
Well, I think Russia would try to frustrate those goals. The question is, what would it accept at the end of the day? And so much depends here on what Western policy is, what American policy is, how the Ukrainians themselves undertake the reforms that will be necessary to join both NATO and the EU. One of the reasons that the Russians have always been concerned about Ukraine is because the Russians feel vulnerable. No matter how difficult it may be for us to understand that or appreciate that, when you look at Russia, this massive country, right, 11 time zones, how could they think that they don't have enough strategic depth? How can they believe that they're vulnerable to attack from the West? Well, there's a lot of history that underscores that vulnerability. The question, I think, is how do you think of strategic depth in the current situation, which may not be measured so much in territory as it will over time be measured in the dislocation of military forces. That's where arms control comes in. This is how we dealt with the issue of strategic depth in many ways during the Cold War. So a solution to the problem long term will have to be arms control agreements that prevent the concentration of forces along this long NATO-Russia frontier. What the distance will be is a matter of negotiation. The other sort of confidence building measures. There have to be security guarantees for Ukraine. There have to be security guarantees for Russia going forward. So it's a complex situation, but certainly not one that is beyond the capabilities of good diplomats, serious strategists to develop the types of institutions, arrangements that are necessary to minimally satisfy the goals that Russia has, as well as the minimal goals that Ukraine has.
Yes, on the score of diplomacy, a rather depressing question about just how good is US diplomacy by now, or has in fact there been a severe decline in the quality of the State Department and the Foreign Service since you served in it?
Well, I think if we're being frank, we would say that the deterioration in U.S. diplomacy actually began with the end of the Cold War. If you look back in the decades before the end of the Cold War, you can name a number of first-rate secretaries of state, for example, strategic thinkers that put in place policies, again, with the help of the president, obviously with the help of the president, that produced outcomes that were deeply advantageous to the United States. It's hard to think of or name a Secretary of State that has played that role in the post-Cold War world. There's been I would argue, a general degradation in the quality of our strategic thinking, our ability to understand the way the world functions and position ourselves in the world in a way that advantages or advances American interest. You've also seen, I would argue, some decline in the quality of people who go into the foreign service, into our diplomatic corps. There's much more competition from the business sector. For example, government service doesn't pay that well, I would argue. But I also think that the foreign service itself has reformed its internal processes in ways that tend to disadvantage people who are ambitious and clear thinkers, because it's made it much more difficult to advance up the ranks. And so those people have tended to leave to employ their talents elsewhere. So short answer is the United States needs to get serious about diplomacy. We need to reform the way our foreign service operates, and we need to do a much better effort at recruiting the best and brightest of the upcoming generation, and persuade them that government service is both important and can be extremely rewarding, something that we've failed to do over the past 30 years.
Yes, I was struck by a piece, where was it? Maybe in the Financial Times, or I can't remember, about the present Biden cabinet and senior officials saying that at the next, after the next elections, so many of them are going to leave for the private sector again, either, to be fair, because they're worn out, or simply, for greater pay. And nobody in Washington, it seems, finds this at all odd. But given that these people have been, talking up the intense crisis in which America allegedly finds itself in the world, you would have thought there would be some inhibition against leaving the service of the state at that moment, if you actually believed what you had been saying.
Well, I'm not going to talk about the individuals.
Not individuals, no, but perhaps a certain problem with the culture.
There needs to be a sense that we need to do these things long term, particularly given the nature of the challenges that we face. One of those challenges is, in fact, to lay out a clear direction for American foreign policy in a world that's much different from the one that we experienced in the 1990s and the 2000s. The fact is the United States cannot dominate the global environment the way we had previously. Whether the world is becoming multipolar, polycentric, how many poles there are and so forth, it is clear that power is much more diffuse now than it was in the past, that it requires, the United States doesn't have the economic, technological advantages that it had in the past. And so it is going to require a much defter foreign diplomacy in order to advance its interest. The way forward has to be laid out in the next couple of years. And President Biden has talked about an inflection point. It's an inflection point we need to reconsider how we're going to deal with the situation on the other side of that inflection point. Putting that policy in place and then making it more or less permanent in the American situation requires more than one term. So you would hope that people would come in with the sense that I'm prepared to do this for a full 2 terms on the assumption that the president I'm working for gets reelected. That will be critical to, I think, advancing or articulating clearly what America's goals and mission is, and then putting that in place both institutionally and intellectually in the years ahead. So yes, short answer, I would like to see people more dedicated to the long term, and then think about writing their memoir somewhat later in life than is usually the case.
Yeah. A question about compartmentalization. Washington for many years argued that we should oppose Russia where necessary and cooperate where possible. Is such compartmentalization of our disagreements possible after the invasion of Ukraine? Or in fact, is managing our differences over Ukraine a precondition for progress on other matters, arms control, climate?
Well, look, I mean, I never thought that you can compartmentalize this relationship. Yes, to a certain extent, the strategic equation, because of the existential nature, was something of an exception. But even then, what happens elsewhere in the relationship does impact on the ability to agree on to certain conditions within the strategic framework. And that's always been true. Now, everything is connected in one way or another. You can't compartmentalize. We certainly can't develop a relationship with Russia where we only work on things that we're interested in and ignore things that they're interested in. So you've got to deal across the full range of issues. Those where we may share interests, those where we're competitive, and then try to find the appropriate balance. What happens in Ukraine, how we position ourselves in Ukraine, is going to impact on the way the Russians think about nuclear arms control agreements. Their definition of strategic stability goes well beyond simply managing the nuclear relationship to managing the potential or managing great power competition. So these two things are inevitably linked in the real world. We're not going to be able to separate them because we find that convenient for ourselves. And the Russians, I think, will continue to insist that we talk about all these things together.
A question about a central theme of your book and its recommendations. Can you comment on Russia's calculation of the risks associated with being China's increasingly junior partner, given the historical relationship between the two countries? Is this still an issue for the Russian elites, in your view, or has the West come completely to eclipse those older fears?
No, I think this is still an issue for Russians. Obviously, they are looking towards a closer relationship with China now to deal with the problems that they have with the West. I mean, the whole motivation for a turn to the East was initially to counterbalance an excessive reliance on the West, to open up space for Russia to maneuver on the global stage. It became one-dimensional as the estrangement with the West grew in the 2010s, I would argue, and then became almost complete with the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Obviously, there is a strategic alignment now that is based on both countries' concern about the U.S. role in the world, the complementary aspects of their economy, the types of their political system, and the personal relationship between Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin. But none of the tensions in the relationship have disappeared either. The historical grievances, territorial grievances the Chinese have, the role that nationalism and racism plays in both countries as they look at the countries ahead, at the centuries or the time ahead. And for the Russians, the challenge that they face over the long term in dealing with a much bigger country to the east. Little factoid that I always find of interest. In 1992, the Russian economy and the Chinese economy were roughly the same size. Today, the Chinese economy is 10 times greater, and it's growing, and that gap is growing. The Chinese just landed a lunar probe on the dark side of the moon. The Russian lunar probe crashed into the moon's surface. The Russians are incapable of doing something now that they could do 50 years ago. So they're going to face a challenge with China going forward. And the question they have to ask, and I've heard Russians ask this even now, is how are you going to counterbalance against China over the long term? The thought is that we can use the global south, Eurasia. That's what the Shanghai Cooperation Forum is about to some extent. That's what the BRICS are about to some extent. I would argue that you can't really form a reliable counterbalance to China among the countries of the global south. They simply don't have the military, technological, or economic wherewithal for that. The only place you find a counterbalance is in the West, and particularly the United States. Conclusion, for Russia's own long-term interests, they have to find a way to rebuild the relationship with the United States. We, by the same token, also have an interest in rebuilding a relationship with Russia that enables us to work with Russia and other countries in order to channel China's energies in ways that aren't detrimental to our interests. So there's a strategic logic for a better relationship in both capitals. We're simply not in a position where anyone is prepared to operate on that assumption right now. I think eventually we'll get there. Our ability to articulate that in public is also an important, I think, element in preparing the grounds for the reopening of channels of communications between our two countries and bringing the crisis in Ukraine to a resolution that Russia, Ukraine, and we can live with.
God willing. Final question. Can you give us your evaluation of the role of Putin's personality and perspectives in everything that's happened? Would the world be very different if he had retired or departed the scene 10 years ago, in your view?
Short answer is yes. And I think Putin himself has changed over time. When he first came to power, I would argue that Putin fell well within the parameters of Russia's strategic thinking. Very pragmatic, I think acutely aware of the balance of power and acted in ways to advance Russia's interests without running undue risks. Since he returned to the Kremlin in 2012, I think particularly since his very profound isolation during the COVID pandemic, that he has moved from a pragmatic view of the world to something that I would call a messianic view of the world, and has begun to think of himself in a much different way that goes beyond the parameters of traditional Russian foreign policy thinking. Clearly, he sees himself in the line of great czars. He wants to regain or expand Russia's territory. He's also presenting Russia and himself as a leader of a global anti-colonial movement, despite the fact that there's very little evidence that the global South wants a full rupture with the West or they want to follow Russia down this path. Messianic thinking has almost always led to overstretch and strategic setbacks from Russia historically. And I think that's what you're seeing play itself out right now. So his personality is important. All that said, even absent Putin, Ukraine would be an issue for the Russian political elites. It will continue to be an issue. What we can hope for is that after Putin, we see the emergence of a Russian leader that is more pragmatic, returns to the traditional patterns of Russian strategic thought. Russia will still be a rival, but there will be an opportunity to talk and build a much more constructive relationship with that new leader. So we have what we have at this point. It's very difficult to see radical change as long as Putin is at the helm, and as long as we remain ensconced in the way we think about the future. But one hopes in the not too distant future, a new leader will emerge in Russia, and we will begin to rethink our position in our relationship with Russia, and as I said, move from an adversarial relationship to something that I call constructive competition.
Let's hope. Well, Tom, thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion. I urge everybody to read Tom's book, Getting Russia Right, an exceptionally important document concerning US-Russian relations. And I'm sorry I couldn't take all your questions. Time is limited. And I hope to see some of you at least at our panels, same time tomorrow on Nagorno-Karabakh and on Thursday on the Middle East. So Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.